Okay, thank you very much for joining me. This is Joshua Wayne, and welcome to the webinar, How to Help Struggling Teen Boys Become Confident Young Men. I appreciate you setting some time aside this evening to listen to this presentation. I'm looking forward to sharing with you. I'm actually going to take the slides off. Most of the presentation will have slides. But I thought I would first just give you the ability to see who's behind the curtain here for a second. So my name is Joshua Wayne. If you're not familiar with my work, thank you very much once again for coming. I'm going to mostly, show you slides as I talk tonight through the presentation, but I just thought I'd let you get a sense of who I am. What I'm going to share tonight is it's maybe a pretty different approach from things you may have heard before about struggling teen boys. It's been something that's really informed my work for many years, but that I haven't shared explicitly before like I'm going to do tonight. It's been something that's been on my mind for a long time that I wanted to share like in a webinar and a talk and so forth. And for whatever reason, the time just really felt right. So I'm really excited to share it with you. I'm going to share with you a basic framework for how to think about what's going on with struggling teen boys specifically. And then I'm going to share with you 6 ideas, 6 strategies, if you will, that you can use to help them. I could probably do an entire webinar on each of the 6 strategies. So tonight you're going to kind of get more of an overview of each of them in as much detail as I can go into in the time that we have here tonight. Just to tell you a bit about me, again, if you're not familiar with my work, I call myself a family coach and youth mentor. I was originally trained as a family therapist. But even early on after grad school, I just sort of drifted away from wanting to do any kind of traditional therapy. And there's sort of a long story to that, or at least a few pieces to the story, which I'm not going to share with you tonight. But it's just evolved over the years, again, into what I call family coaching and youth mentoring. And really, it's just my own unique take on helping struggling teens and their parents. Depending on the situation, I may work more with a teenager in what I would call professional mentoring capacity. And really, it's about helping them get the skills and the tools they need to build their self-confidence, to feel confident about the direction they're going in, to make good decisions about their life, and really to transition successfully to adulthood. Sometimes, and it just really depends on the scenario, I end up working more with the parents. Sometimes it's just because it's just obvious that the work is really more there to give the parents coaching and feedback. Sometimes I just can't establish a connection with the teen, often because there's a lot of discord in their relationship with their parents, and they'll kind of come in and see me as the hired hitman, if you will. And it's just hard to make that connection. So what I end up doing is working more with the parents in a coaching capacity, giving them some communication coaching on the things to be saying, the things not to be saying, and basically how to build a strong relationship that's going to last for years. And a big piece of that becomes how to stop weakening their relationship by fighting the wrong battles, so that they can play a really positive role in helping their teen get on moving in the right direction. So that's really what I do. I've also done a lot of work in schools and community mental health agencies over the years, leading different initiatives, and I do a lot of speaking and presentations and so forth. So that is a quick bit about me. If you want to learn more about me, I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end, and just sort of how to get in touch with me. I always start with a free consultation for parents that are contemplating working with me or just want to get some feedback and just to see if it's a good fit. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end and how to get in touch with me. In the meantime, though, I am going to go back to the slides, and we will go from there. So, okay, so what am I talking about here tonight? So that is the bio, you heard that. So who are we talking about here tonight? So obviously the topic is struggling teen boys. And there are a few different profiles or trends that I see when talking about struggling teen boys. Now, not everything I'm going to share with you is going to universally apply to every struggling teen. So don't take it necessarily as a playbook or a formula that's going to work sequentially with every young man. But like I said, what I'm going to share with you is a framework that I've been using for a long time, that's really worked well for me, that I've really found to be effective. So the first trend is teen boys that really have low self-confidence, and they may often seem withdrawn, not socially engaged. Maybe they have some friends, but they often just don't seem like they have a lot of meaningful engagement in their life. Sometimes it's kind of hard for their parents to read where they're at and to communicate with them. They may or may not be very engaged in school. It's often very common with those young boys that they're sort of retreating into technology in a pretty intense way, playing video games many hours a day. Again, just some trends and patterns that I see. Another trend is sort of the teen that's more boisterous, maybe more reckless, aggressive, hanging with other struggling teens. A lot of times there's sort of a false confidence that they're projecting. And a lot of times they have a lot of anger issues and often don't really know how to control it. They may be prone to throw tantrums if they don't get what they want, and often seem very immature. And by the way, even the more withdrawn young boys are often equally angry. They just tend to internalize it. So it's kind of a pretty common trend. There's some other teen boys, though, that may not seem to have these outward issues, but they're still challenged and they're still having a hard time. A lot of them are actually pretty sensitive, more introverted types who actually think pretty deeply about things. And sometimes that sensitivity and that emotional depth and the things that they think about and they feel about are difficult for them because it makes it sort of hard for them to fit in easily with others. They may feel out of place in a peer group where they have trouble finding people that they can really relate to because they're just kind of thinking at a different level, but kind of feel alone in that. A lot of times, these boys, not necessarily the last group, but just generally speaking, may be labeled ADHD. They may be struggling significantly in school. It's also quite possible that in the mix of all of this, there are substance use issues going on, mostly marijuana and alcohol. In fact, smoking pot may actually be more common than drinking alcohol in a number of cases. And there's one other sort of big trend group that I just want to identify because it's actually quite common. I end up working a lot with these young men. And I'm talking about young men that are really actually in their 20s and 30s already. So they're not really teens per se, although emotionally and psychologically they still are, but they're in their 20s and even 30s, and they're just really still struggling to find their sense of direction. Their self-confidence may be really low. Their feet aren't on the ground. I've often heard them referred to as the failure to launch group. And maybe they've gone to college and then they find themselves back at home. They didn't have the structure, or they were partying too much and just couldn't make it at college. Maybe they're living at home with their parents. Maybe they're working, maybe going to school, maybe not. In a number of cases, they may be living on their own, like in their own apartment with parental support. But the theme here is that they just don't have the maturity and the tools they need to take that next step towards independence. And again, like smoking pot can be very common with that group. This is sort of one last point to make around this. It's that regardless of the scenario, regardless of the teen and what they're going through, and any of the different sort of trends or profiles that I talked about, one thing that may also be really true is that as a result of what's going on with your teen and his struggles, that there's a lot of discord in your relationship with him. You may, feel like you're walking around on eggshells quite a bit, and it's just very stressful. And you're probably concerned already about his future, and that certainly. And then there's also just the day-to-day stress of just not getting along with him. So that, in a nutshell, is really what I'm talking about in terms of struggling teens. So here's my core premise that I'm going to share with you. And everything I'm going to share with you tonight is basically built around this core theme and this core idea. I'm going to go deeper into it and kind of share the framework with you, and then I'll come back and talk about the 6 specific strategies that you can use or that are really helpful to help him make this transition. So the core premise, and much of what I'm going to talk about, is that the transition from adolescence to adulthood for young men comes from accessing their inner warrior archetype. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, let me clarify what I don't mean by that. It's just good to be clear that this does not mean that they have to go become a soldier or learn to fight. This is really a psychological concept about accessing something within themselves, How that then shows up in their world, in their life, is a totally different story. Maybe some of them would, pursue military, but that's not principally what this is about. This is not about choosing a path of violence. It's first and foremost about finding something within that I'm calling the warrior archetype. Now, to understand the warrior archetype, let me step back for a second and just talk about archetypes in general and what they are. Some folks may be familiar with this, and some, might be helpful just to have a little bit of clarification. In literature, in mythology, an archetype is a typical character that represents some universal aspect or pattern of human nature. And they're just central to human experience. And so they show up in cultures and stories all over the world. And the concept has been around since at least the time of Plato, but it's been more popularized in the last 150, 120 some years by the psychologist Carl Jung. But you see archetypes everywhere in books, in stories, in movies, in myths. And so there's a number of examples on this slide. There's the nurturer, the magician, the lover, the outlaw, sort of the bad boy, the creator, the sage, the hero, the regular guy. These are just character types, but there's so many more. You could probably come up with, I don't know if you could come up with an exhaustive list. There's the athlete or the jock, the villain, the hero that we said before, the archetypal mother and father. Again, these are all just representations that embody common aspects of human nature, the different roles we play in life or that we're capable of playing. So in masculine psychology, there are 4 major archetypes that are the building blocks in the psychology of every man. And they are the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. There's actually a book by this name called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. Now, I'm going to go through all 4 of these so you have the context and understand sort of the bigger picture that I'm talking about, so you understand sort of the context in which the warrior fits into this. But the talk tonight is primarily going to be about the warrior archetype and specifically how we use it to help struggling teen boys. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the other 3. But before I jump into them, it's just important to note that these are all going to develop in one way or another in every man. There's really no way around it. These are the 4 core roles in a man's life. Now, they may be healthy, they may be unhealthy, they may be well developed, they may be poorly developed. But these are the 4 core roles that men play in their life. And so there's just no stepping around it. So the warrior is really the first one to talk about because it's the first one that really has to develop in a healthy and strong way. And this is the aspect of a man's personality that needs to be harnessed, and particularly with teen boys, to transition successfully to adulthood. Cultivating one's warrior is about finding your power. It's about finding your voice, your self-confidence, so that you can go out into the world and take care of yourself. Now, the job of the archetypal warrior is that he fights, but again, this isn't about violence. It's about finding the courage and the self-confidence to figure out what you want in life and to fight for it. And sometimes there's a struggle on that, which is where the metaphor of the warrior comes from. It takes a certain mentality to deal with adversity and to overcome it, to get back up when we get knocked down. So really the warrior is about facing our fears and our insecurities so we can move forward in life in spite of them. And over time, it's the warrior that allows us to make commitments and choose a path instead of being wishy-washy and non-committal. And again, that's the first one that really has to develop and take root in a healthy way so that the others can come into form in our lives. So the magician is the second one. And the magician is about learning to focus our mind and our attention so we can develop skills and start to develop mastery in a discipline or a course of study. So where the warrior is the brawn, the magician is really the brains. It's really about focusing ourselves so we can learn something and bring value into the world. One of the most common mythological representations of this is the alchemist. And the alchemists were an ancient group of philosophers and scientists who, through their contemplative and scientific processes, tried to convert lead into gold. They try to do lots of different things, changing matter, but sort of the one that people most often refer to is converting lead into gold. And that's really sort of the metaphor here for the magician. It's that the magician learns to create something from nothing. So as a young man, we learn, as we start to develop our magician, we learn to take the raw materials of ourselves, our brains, our intelligence, maybe our physical abilities, just those raw materials, and through focus and gaining skills, whether it's learning a trade or going to school or apprenticing in something, that we're able to turn that into value in the world. Again, sort of lead into gold. So whether we become an electrician or a lawyer, it's where we develop a craft. It's where we develop that focus. That's the domain of the magician. The next one that develops is the lover. And the lover is about making commitments to others. It's where we learn to surrender and be vulnerable, to open our hearts to someone or something. Of course, the most common form that this often takes is romantic love and marriage, maybe eventually parenting, and the love that opens up. It's really the more softer, empathetic side of a man that needs to be cultivated. But it's also about spirituality and recognizing that there's something greater than us, that we're a part of something much bigger, which is another form of surrender and vulnerability. It's about cultivating a higher purpose of meaning in our life that goes beyond just ourselves. So that really is the domain of the lover. It's about surrender and coming into contact with something greater than ourselves, whether it's love for our family or some kind of higher calling or higher purpose. And then finally, after all three of those develop and they're held in relative balance and in a healthy way, the king archetype, that king energy, starts to emerge. And the king is about leadership. It's about providing for others. It's about commitment and having a long view of things, and really starting to be able to think about what's good, not just for us, but for others and for those we care for. It's about blessing others and working to help them. And if you think about mythological kings and stories, when there was a healthy, strong king, the crops grew well. There was peace in the land. The people were happy. There was abundance. People prospered. When there was a bad king, there was a drought. The crops didn't grow. There was war. There was famine. So in many ways, that's sort of the metaphor, is that when that king energy can develop in a healthy way, which means that the warrior, the magician, and the lover were all able to be cultivated and held in relative balance, that king can start to come and brings a sense of balance and generativity to our lives, where we can stand not just for ourselves, but also for others. So there's one final point I want to make about the archetypes, and I sort of indicated it before, and it's that all of them can have either a positive expression or a negative expression when a man is off balance. And when it's held in a negative way, it's often referred to as, like, say, the shadow, or just a negative representation, because it's not held in balance. So again, it's important to understand that the warrior, and all these archetypes, but the warrior, coming back to the main purpose of this call, is going to show up in all men. There's no way around it. It's going to either be in a healthy, positive form, a mature form, or it's going to show up in a negative and immature way. So, a healthy warrior is guided by doing the right thing. He has a tremendous heart. It's a very principled way to operate. The job of the archetypal warrior, of a healthy warrior, is that he fights for truth and justice for himself, for his family, for the greater good, for those that need defending. He speaks up and he does the right thing in simple terms. An unhealthy warrior is, the shadow aspect of it is going to show up generally in one of two ways. If it's not developed well, if it's not developed in a healthy way, and this is going to be very common in struggling teen boys coming full circle. And the shadow aspects of the warrior are the bully. You could also look at it as a predatory or a mercenary, soldier of fortune, or the weakling. somebody who's a victim, a weakling. So the bully aspect of it doesn't live by the warrior code of honor. He's out there to serve himself and his own narrow self-interest. He may prey on others and their vulnerabilities. He may seem strong on the outside, but it's really actually a negative manifestation, because inwardly there's a lot of fear and a lot of weakness, and so that's why they perpetrate others. The other aspect to it, sort of the converse aspect to the bully, is the weakling, which is somebody, a boy who lets himself get walked all over, or who just doesn't own his power and his potential. He's scared to step into it. He doesn't have discipline and focus, may be withdrawn. He just lacks the courage to be committed and to really find his power and to find his voice and to speak up for himself. So that's really the basic premise about warriorship and what we're looking to do. We're trying to really help teen boys start to access and cultivate and harness that positive inner warrior energy, because that is what they need to break through their fears, to break through the obstacles that are holding them back, and to take that step towards independence and adulthood. And it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey. So before we get into the specific strategies, there's one other point that I want to make. And it's sort of just a general thing to think about. But if at all possible, it's ideal if they have a mentor that they can buy into in this process. As my friend and colleague Josh Shipp says, every kid is one caring adult away from being a success story. And so it really is the ideal scenario if there's a significant adult in their life who they buy into and can be that guide and that role model for them. Now, this may be able to be you, mom and dad. And to some extent, there's a good chance it can be, but it also may need to be somebody else. There may need to be some other adult that comes into the life, particularly if you've had a lot of discord with them and if you're not on the same page with them and there's a lot of conflict. They really may need someone else in their life to help guide them on that journey. Now, they may be able to happen upon it and figure things out by trial and error. I mean, certainly that can happen. But if they can come into contact with a caring adult who connects with them, it really is extremely helpful. And there really is a historical precedent for this. You know, it shows up in myths where a guide of one form or another comes to the aid of the hero on his journey. So obviously the image here is Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan Kenobi comes along to Luke when he needs someone to guide him, when he needs a mentor, when he needs someone to help him figure out what the way forward is. In the Matrix, Neo finds Morpheus, but you see this throughout stories and myths since the beginning of time. And historically, just in our culture, there were wise elders who were around that we could often connect with, or we found our way into an apprenticeship and maybe it happened there, or maybe there was an uncle or a friend or another family member or a friend of the family that became that role model. You know, in some cases it probably happened within a family where a father passed his trade or his farm down to his son. But that's just much less common these days. We just don't have those structures anymore. So whether it's a therapist or a coach that you help them find, or a school teacher or a relative or a sports coach or a martial arts instructor or a youth group leader, if you can find some other adult that they can connect with and buy into, it's really going to help at least one other person, because that's through that role modeling that we learn so much just from other people's life experience. You know, it's from the little day-to-day things like how to talk to a potential employer, to how to dress for a job interview, to how to manage our emotions and just deal with the things that happen on a day-to-day basis, to the big stuff about handling major setbacks and figuring out what career to pursue and how to resolve conflicts and so forth. So just one thing to think about, that, you know, as a parent and you're listening to this and considering these tools and these ideas, there's a lot of things you can probably help them with, and it's also important to realize where it's helpful to find other significant adults that they can connect with and get some guidance that they need. So how to help them? I'm going to again share 6 ideas with you, and just bear in mind as we go through these 6 that this stuff takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. What I'm really talking about is a growing up process. but I'm going to share tools with you that I think can really help them do it right. And with some boys, this development may happen really quickly, but with others, it's just going to take some time. You can't push the river. It's going to flow at its own pace. There's no necessarily simple switch you can just flick. So way to help, number one, is about self-acceptance and teaching them about self-acceptance. A lot of young men who are struggling have low self-esteem. They don't feel good about themselves. They're inwardly insecure. They may have a lot of fears or just have a very poor self-concept. They may have had failure in school. They may socially struggle. They may have a lot of anger and conflicting emotions, and they just don't know how to deal with it. So one of the first and most critical things they have to learn is that they are okay as they are. That regardless of what's going on for them, regardless of what their experience is and the emotions they're having, and the challenges they're having and the struggle they're going through, regardless of that, they're okay. They're fundamentally okay. Now, this doesn't mean there isn't room for self-improvement. There is for all of us, of course. But I really like this quote that no amount of self-improvement can make up for any lack of self-acceptance. So one thing that we have to really help them get is to learn to come to really deeply accept themselves and make peace with themselves. You know, if they're constantly fighting the reality of how they're feeling and the circumstances of their life, then this is something that really has to be taught to them so that they can start to accept where they are and what's going on and focus on starting to make positive changes. There's really no way to do that without first having self-acceptance and coming to a place that he's okay with just who he is. And again, this is a process, but he needs to learn how to slow down. And by the way, this is really warrior work, because the warrior's first battles are not outside of himself. It's internal. And this in many ways is really the first battle. Are you okay as you are? So he really needs to get the skills in order to do this. And that really is deep and powerful work, to be able to accept himself and his imperfections. And the truth is that it's not just critically important for himself to come to that realization and to develop that understanding that he is okay as he is, imperfect as he is, but it's also critical because it later teaches him to accept the imperfections in others, which is something an adult needs to do. He can't really have successful relationships with you, his parents, with friends, and ultimately with a significant other if he doesn't learn how to accept the imperfections of others. So that's really what the first one is about, is really teaching him to have a deep level of self-acceptance. And it ties very naturally into the second one, which is teaching him to take full responsibility of his life. And in some ways, this is similar to the first one about self-acceptance, but there's some significant differences. This too is a really critical skill, and it isn't easy. And frankly, many adults struggle with this and may never come to fully understand it and own it. And the idea here, the thing to share here is that he needs to learn is that nobody is doing things to him. Nobody makes him do anything. We're all choosing 100% our reactions to things that happen around us. Even if we live in terrible conditions, under oppression and poverty, we still have the capacity to choose how we think about things and about how we're going to respond to them. And this is really important for struggling teen boys because it's very common for them to point the finger at others for their situation. They may blame you, mom and dad, for their problems, for what they perceive as they think is your fault because you did something to them or you didn't give them something that they think they needed. It could be with their teachers or other adults that they have in their life. It could be kids at school. It's very common for them to be pointing the finger outward. So really what we're trying to teach him here is that he's not a victim. That even if he's been wronged, he can ultimately only be happy if he accepts 100% responsibility for his life and stops blaming others. Again, this too is not an overnight process. This can be years of learning, but it's an important thing that we gently have to start to teach him, because there's really no way he can grow up and become a successful adult if he doesn't take a high level of responsibility for himself and his situation and stop blaming others. And I don't want to make it sound like you can just give him some rosy poem. You can just give some poem to a 16-year-old boy that's nice to read, and he's going to have an epiphany that's going to change it on the spot. Again, this is a growing up process. And in many ways, what we're talking about here, we talk about taking responsibility for his life, is teaching him the skills he needs to manage his emotions. And that in spite of what others may do or may say, to teach him how to find and hold his inner sense of balance, and that his power and his sense of control ultimately come from within. Again, this is a critical life school, a critical life lesson for adults too, for that matter. Most of us need reminders from time to time at least about this principle. But this is, again, a seed that we have to start planting for him. And sort of one final piece about this, I talked about it a little bit in the process. And this really saddles my first 2 points about self-acceptance and self-responsibility. And it's giving him a healthy way to deal with his anger. He can't resolve his anger until he first accepts it, going back to the first principle, right? It's just part of your reality. And if you fight it, if he fights it, it becomes stronger. So with his anger, there is an acceptance piece. It's really, really important. And then at the same time, he also has to own it and stop looking to make others responsible for what happened to him, and stop pointing the finger outward and making others pay for his frustration and his difficulties. So that's another just key piece to this, is that there's often a real skill building component to this around how to deal with anger. And a lot of struggling teen boys have a lot of anger. That's going to be a key piece of what they're dealing with. Okay, way to help number 3. Don't baby him. Another way of saying this is to stop enabling him. Very often I see with struggling teen boys, particularly the older they get, where their parents are enabling them. And what often happens is that with the best of intentions, they get in the way of healthy struggle and letting him experience the natural consequences of his actions and his choices. That may mean that they're constantly trying to bail him out when he gets into trouble. This can be from his parents. It can even be at school. A lot of times, teachers or administrators don't want to hold him accountable for his choices because of the anger that's there beneath the surface, and they don't want to deal with it, so they may tiptoe around it. Or mom and dad too, not setting clear limits, not holding him accountable for his choices. And that really can end up holding him back by babying him. I actually really like this quote a lot, that a helping hand is not always the best. As he gets older, instead of just tiptoeing around him at home and trying to avoid his tantrums, it may be that there's financial support going on that's too much and for too long a period of time. And so he's never forced to start really taking greater level of responsibility for himself and his situation. And I get that this can be a very tricky tightrope to walk about where do you help him out? Where do you support him, and where do you let him figure it out on his own? Where do you let him fend for himself? Obviously, we don't want to let him catastrophically fail in a way that's going to damage his self-worth over the long haul. But at the same time, he also needs to be able to experience the natural consequences of his choices. He needs to be challenged. He's got to have some responsibility and some accountability, because that's how his confidence is going to grow. It's, we get big muscles. We get muscles by getting in the gym and working out and being sore, not just by sitting on the sidelines. So there's got to be some sort of struggle and strain in order to build our confidence. That's how we grow as people through adversity. It's another quote that I just wanted to share. This was posted by my jiu-jitsu instructor on our Facebook group that I thought was really interesting not too long ago. No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. I can't quite figure out what's going on in this picture. It looks like this guy's jumping over the wall to run with the bulls in Pamplona or something like that, but I like the quote a lot. But that's really it, that life is filled with challenges and setbacks, and he's got to start to learn to work through them now. So of course you want to help him and support him, but you have to learn to walk that fine line and not try to fix everything. Some struggle and imperfection is okay. And coming back to my original warrior metaphor, how else is he going to ready himself for battle? If he doesn't learn to face challenges and the ups and downs of life, how is he going to take care of himself in the world? Again, remember that warrior archetype, that warrior role, that faculty in him is about getting him the self-confidence so he can go take care of himself in the world. Okay, the next one, number 4, is about building self-confidence. There's a lot of ways that the teen boys can build their self-confidence. And in many ways, if you think about it, this is really intrinsic to the whole warrior metaphor. First and foremost, we build our self-confidence through accomplishing things, by having positive relationships, by achieving things, whether it's school or a hobby. By having success is really how we get our confidence. One other way, though, that I found that I want to talk a bit about, that I've also found to be very helpful, especially with teen boys, is helping them learn to feel more physically self-confident. Really learning to build their self-confidence through strengthening themselves physically and getting more physically strong. And this feeds very much into the warrior metaphor. The more physically strong and capable they are, the more confident he's going to feel walking around. Now, it's only one piece of the puzzle. Just because he's strong and starts to build muscles doesn't mean he's going to necessarily be confident. There's lots of men out there walking around with enormous muscles that are inwardly very insecure. But done right, and as a part of some of these other strategies, building up his physical strength, getting stronger will make him feel better about himself, he'll feel more attractive, and it also helps him walk around not feeling like a victim. It probably won't come as much of a surprise to you, given as much resonance as I feel with the warrior metaphor and the things I talk about, but I've also found that martial arts can be a really strong way to help build that confidence in a really positive and healthy way. Done right, martial arts are really about character development. It's about developing healthy warriorship. It's not about perpetrating others or being able to beat people up. It's really about having the warrior code and being able to stand up for what's right and what's just. So really the martial arts are about healthy warriorship. So really building his self-confidence is something that can really, again, help him transition as one piece of the overall puzzle. Number 5 is about helping him develop a healthy sexual identity. Now, what I mean by this is helping him be comfortable with himself and who he is becoming as a sexual being. Now, I'm not saying that he needs to go out and start being sexually active, especially if he's not emotionally ready to do so. It's really not about that. It's just recognizing that that aspect, his sexuality, his sexual identity, his sexual drive is really coming alive at this point in his life, and he has to have a positive relationship to that, plain and simple. We want him to be on a positive trajectory in that way so that he feels good about himself and that so he can ultimately learn to have healthy, meaningful, respectful, good, healthy connections with other people. And so that really is about having a positive, healthy sexual identity and being on a good trajectory there, whether he's sexually active or not. Assuming he's heterosexual, this could be about just having self-confidence and knowing how to talk confidently to girls and make connections. If a teen boy is struggling in that way and he doesn't know how to talk to girls, that's hard. It's a hard place to be in, and it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating story where he just feels he lacks confidence, he doesn't know how to talk to girls, and so he avoids it, and it just becomes a difficult place for him to be. So really helping him work through that and build that self-confidence so that he can connect meaningfully with girls is a really, really, really positive step. If he's gay, then supporting him to develop a healthy, positive identity around that could be the work. Again, so that he just has a very positive sense of his sexuality as he's growing up so that he can become a healthy adult. Again, this can quickly become a complex topic, so I'm really not going to go into greater detail about it. But again, as I mentioned, this is just an intrinsic part of human life, and it's awakening big time in teen boys. And so having a healthy identity around this is a really important thing so we can become a well-adjusted adult. And a lot of struggling boys, one way or another, this is often very out of whack. They may just be very shy and uncertain about things and scared. And so it's a really important thing to help them start to build their confidence in. Number 6, lastly, the final tool is about developing a higher calling. If you recall, I talked earlier about the warrior manifestation and how that can be healthy or unhealthy. It can be positive or negative. And this is really true of all the archetypes, for the king, warrior, the magician, and the lover. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the positive and negative manifestations of all 4 of them in this talk. But there is one key distinction that I want to make that really does make the difference for all of them, between being positive and negative. And it's having a higher calling. Does he have some sort of higher purpose that he serves? If you only serve yourself in your own narrow interests, it's very hard to be healthy and in balance. It's just very, very difficult. One of my favorite examples of this in a movie is a movie called Matchstick Men. And it's about a con man. And the main character is played by Nicolas Cage. And he's a brilliant con man, really, really savvy. He swindles people, with unbelievable skill. He's a true con. But in the movie, oh, and by the way, the con artist is the negative shadow manifestation of the magician. It's someone who uses their smarts and their abilities to prey on others. In this movie, though, this character, the Nicolas Cage character, he's suffering intensely from obsessive compulsive disorder. And he's really sick. He can't leave the house without clicking on the light switch 15, 20 times. It's totally running his life. He's really, really out of balance and unhealthy. Long story short, some traumatic things happen to him that cause him to ultimately leave the con game. And he basically walks away from it. He realizes that it's not the right thing to be doing. And he goes and he gets an honest job and he just starts living a straight life. And what's interesting is that all the symptoms disappear. And so the message is that if you're using your abilities to serve yourself and to take advantage of others, if it's all about your own narrow interest, if there's no higher calling that guides you, you're not going to be healthy, you're not going to be well. So the last piece to help a struggling teen boy cultivate and develop is this sense of a higher calling. Now, this can have a pretty wide berth, and I'm not trying to define it in any particular way. It could be a religious or spiritual higher calling. It could be a cause that he cares a lot about. It could be other people he wants to stand for. Really, the question we're helping him answer is, what's the greater vision for your life? Who's the man you want to become, and who do you stand for? Who do you serve? What do you serve? What's your bigger purpose? In many ways, this is really about helping him cultivate his moral compass. The real guiding question here is, what is the right thing to do and what is not the right thing to do? As long as we've been human beings, we've grappled with that question, and your son needs to as well. That's just a part of moral development in growing up. And so helping him start to cultivate this higher calling and figure out what is the bigger thing that he's a part of, that he wants to help define his life, is a really, really critical thing to help him start to keep developing. So those are the 6 things. So I'm going to wrap up here. I really appreciate your time and you listening. I want to just close with a couple thoughts for you. A lot of what we talked about here tonight was about really helping him cultivate his inner warrior, that aspect of himself that is about building confidence, courage to go out into the world, so that in spite of his fears and whatever insecurities he may feel, that he still is willing to move forward and take those healthy risks as he moves towards adulthood. Really finding his power in his voice and getting on that positive path. Just to reiterate and to share with you, one of the most important things you can do to support that as best you can is to build and maintain a strong connection with him. You as a parent or significant other in his life to build and maintain a strong connection with him. At the end of the day, the strength of your relationship may be the most significant thing you have going for you in your relationship with him that can possibly influence him to make the right choices. And he's hard enough to control when he's sitting right next to you, let alone when he's up in his bedroom or off with his friends. But if you maintain a connection with him, if you learn to carefully stop weakening it by not fighting the wrong battles, by being his ally as much as you can and trying to play a significant role in his life and just stay connected, you at least can influence his choices so that when he's not around, when he's not under your supervision, you can at least influence the kind of decisions that he'll make. So the things that the choices he'll make would at least be aligned with the kind of choices you would hope he would make. There's no guarantees, of course, but the more you stay connected, the more you keep that positive connection going, the better chance you have at guiding it. So, one of the things that I work very close with parents about is not wasting the relationship capital they have with their teen by fighting the wrong battles. And that it can be a real tricky thing to do. And I get that it's often walking a tightrope about where do you have structure and boundaries and where do you let go. But again, that is a really important thing as a parent is staying connected and trying to provide the right guidance. And again, as I talked about before, some of that is about knowing when to also try to help him connect with the right mentors. Sometimes him hearing the exact same words from somebody else will make all the difference. Sometimes they're just things that we need to hear from somebody who's not our parents. And so helping him come into contact with those mentors and those people who can play a significant role in his life, there can be that kind of role model to give him that feedback and the guidance he needs to take that next step can be an incredibly powerful thing to do. So that really